McLean is absent this week. Alexis Pickering is absent. Dale Reynolds.
Here.
Thank you. Todd Lavoie.
Here.
Tom Daly.
Here.
Joe Steer.
Here.
Greg Rast. Debbie Kling is absent. Sabrina Minshall. Lance McGinnis Brown.
Here.
We do have a quorum.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Are there any additions or changes to the agenda? I do not believe that we have any.
Nothing that I have.
So that moves us into the consent agenda. Do we have a motion for approval of the consent agenda?
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we approve the consent agenda as presented.
Excellent. Do we have a second?
I'll second.
That's a motion from Mayor Steer for approval with a second from Lavoie. Did I say that right? Thank you so much, Mr. Lavoie, Councilman Lavoie from Meridian. So any discussion on that motion? With that, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. That'll move us on to, let's see, make sure I don't miss public comments. So I don't know, is there anyone present that was wanting to provide any public comments? Anybody online that would like to provide public comments at this time?
Mr. Chairman, this is Ken Pajan. I'd like to make some public comments.
Yeah, very good. Thank you, Mr. Pajan. I appreciate that. So if you could limit your comments to no more than 3 minutes, we'd appreciate that. And with that, the time is yours.
Yeah, in terms of item 3D on the consent agenda, these are more of questions than anything. On 3D on the consent agenda, the RF Smart contract, was this item bid? And if not, why not? And then if we go to the supplemental services under 6B of your agenda, I realize some of this will be covered later, but my questions are any fares going to be charged for these supplemental services? Are the buses going to run on their regular routes? And is there any revenue being received, like advertising revenue or things of that nature, any other type of revenue that might be received? And I'll get ahead of myself here. I will not have any comments about the Eagle service when the board meets. That concludes my comments. I'm prepared to stand for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. I appreciate that. So we'll allow Elaine to address your questions on 6B when we do get there regarding those supplemental services. So we'll make sure that we note those and get those answered. And then in regards to your questions on consent agenda 3D, I don't know who would be the best one to answer that. Elaine, if that'd be you or one of your staff.
Leslie would be the best one to answer that. Leslie?
Sorry, I joined late. I just got the link to this new meeting. What was the question about? I missed it.
That's okay. The question was, what was the process on the RF Smart contract? I believe it was part of the original ERP procurement, but I don't want to misspeak. So maybe you could answer that one.
It was determined by finance that it was a sole source piece of equipment that we had to use with the EAM software through Oracle. This is what they use for label scanning. So it was considered sole source.
Thank you.
Okay, very good. Thank you so much. Appreciate that info. And as mentioned, those questions on 6B, we'll make sure that Elaine will cover those when we get to that point in the agenda. Okay, that moves us into section 5, Executive Board action items. So first on there is an action item, proposed agenda for the October Board of Directors meeting. Elaine.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman. October Board of Directors meeting, you always give me the opportunity to change the agenda if things come up, but wanted to let you all know that we're already proposing to add some things to that agenda. One would be the course, the minutes of the special meeting, because we will have a special meeting. The budgets for the specialized transportation, as we are presenting it to you today, we'll be presenting it to them as well. We didn't have that on their initial list because it's a new policy. And the action item for the Metro Community Services contract. Metro is part of our Beyond Access service, and we are working with them to do a new contract for that service. Again, that wasn't on the initial calendar. So otherwise, the agenda as proposed, information items are always up for change as information items come up. And so otherwise, the agenda as proposed is what we expect to present at the October board meeting. Again, always with the opportunity to add things if they come up.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Do we have any questions in regards to the proposed agenda for the October Board of Directors meeting? Anyone online have any questions? Okay, so then would we need a motion for?
Yeah, a motion
this?
to.
Mr. Chairman, I would move that we approve the proposed agenda with the acknowledgement that staff may need to add or remove items from the agendas.
All right, do we have a second?
Second.
So it's a motion from Mayor Scher and a second from Lance. Any discussion on that motion? Okay, all those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. So that moves us into Executive Board Action Item B. This is, again, an action item, proposed Executive Board and Board of Directors meeting dates for 2025 and 2026. You should have had those here in the room, that printout, those online. Hopefully you did receive that via email in regards to the proposed meeting dates for 2025 and for 2026. Elaine.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We did not, you should all have a paper copy, and it's now available via email to the rest of the board. Is that correct, Paula? Okay, Paula will email it to the rest of the board. We were still working on a couple of dates. So the proposed meetings, typically we had previously taken the month of August off. And for budget purposes, we think it actually works better for us to take the month of July off and have that first meeting in August where the full board can approve the budget. We tried last year to move it to the end of July, and it ended up getting off on everyone's calendar. So rather than make it not a Monday, first Monday, we're proposing to move the budget approval from the July board meeting to the August board meeting and take the July board meeting off. We'll see that in both the 2025 and the 2026 that are being proposed. One late thing that we've learned since this was published is that there is a particular American Public Transportation Association conference that's happening April 7th. We can still leave the meeting on April 7th and I can join virtually, or we could move the meeting to April 12th. So I thought I would leave that up to the board to discuss.
So we can discuss that. So my thought, I mean, if you're okay with that to do virtually, I would think that we'd leave it there just for consistency. So we know on those dates. I know I had to call Paula even this morning to just confirm that where I'm headed and that we're here in person. So that would be my thoughts. But if there's other discussion or proposals, if people think it'd be better to move it back, we're open for that discussion.
That's fine with me. I just wanted you all to know that I'd be virtual for that one.
Any disagreement from anybody online in regards to leaving it on the 7th and just having Elaine attend virtually? Okay, so I think we look good on that. So then do we have a motion in regards to the proposal of or proposed executive board and board of directors meetings for 2025 and 2026?
Mr. Chairman, I move that we approve the proposed executive board and board of directors meeting dates for 2025 and 2026.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Excellent. So we have a motion from Mayor Steer and a second from Lance in regards to the approval of the board and the executive board and board of directors meetings for 2025 and 2026. Any discussion on that motion? With that, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? And that motion passes. That moves us into section 6 of our agenda, executive board information items. 6A is an information item for transit services consultant presentation. And is Leslie doing this one?
Mr. Chairman, while Jason is getting that pulled up because he's the one that's going to do the presentation, I wonder if we could have the short discussion about the supplemental services before, since Mr. Pajan is still online. I don't know if he wants to stay through this other discussion.
Yeah, that sounds good to me. So yeah, we could go ahead and do that. So if you'd like to, so that'd be 6B, the supplemental services to cover that. And again, answering those questions that Ken had
Yeah.
proposed in this discussion.
Thank you. So I did not prepare a presentation for this. This was an information item that we now told the board we would bring to you, given the new supplemental services policy. You have it in your packet. It outlines the services that we plan to provide this year. I think Mr. Pajan's concern was particularly around the Boise State football game service that we're planning to offer on 6 different nights in September and November through November. Those services will follow the regular routes of the existing service. These are not special services. They are an expansion of the hours and the number of runs on existing routes 2 and 29 during game days. And the purpose of that is to provide an opportunity for folks who don't want to drive their own car downtown and try to park and deal with all of the things that go along with that, to park at a more remote site, get on the bus and ride the bus down. There is a cost to this, as is noted in the memo that was sent to you. And yes, in fact, we will be working to secure advertising. But the advertising is not what pays for this service. What pays for this service is the $50,000 you all approve in our budget every year to allow us to provide supplemental services. And you have also directed us to pursue advertising whenever we can, when opportunities exist, so that we can supplement our budget in other ways with that advertising funding. So yes, in fact, we will be pursuing advertising on these routes, especially with our new infotainment boards that are en route. We can note locations along the route on those. They offer a great opportunity, we think, on these extended hour services that we're proposing. The other question was whether or not we would be charging fares. We are offering the ride free to anyone who shows their game ticket. So there is still fare on board that ride if you're not going to the game, but if you show your game ticket, we're allowing you to ride for free. With the Hyde Park Street Fair, that will be a free service on this Saturday because that's an extended day of that service. Again, it will be following the regular route, and it will also be free on the after hours service on Friday night. So the route typically ends at 5:30. We'll be extending the hours on that, and during that extended hour portion, it will also be free.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Appreciate that information. Are we ready for the transit services consultant presentation?
For letting me do that so that we can now have the discussion about the services.
Good morning, thank you. So I have Robert Babbitt online. He is one of the consultants with SBLBF, who is working with us on this service delivery project we're working on, and I will go ahead and let him take on.
Good morning or good afternoon, and thank you for the opportunity. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's a pleasure to have been selected to do this service. The VRT service delivery is an analysis of both the transit management contracting model and the operating contract model. We recently did a background white paper on how many transit systems are doing what which way. The most definitive study of this type around the country is a bit older now, but the General Accounting Office, by report GAO 13782, got 463 of the transit systems in the country, not all of them, but 463 of the transit systems to respond to a detailed survey. The reasons were asked, why did the contractor pursue this kind of contracting, and what was the outcome of that kind? The maintenance contracting were done by 61%, and many of the things you do right now would be viewed as operations contracting. But to draw a fine line, when the GAO study was talking about operating contracting, they meant you are paying a unit of service fee that could be partially per month, partially per mile, partially per hour, but usually the bulk of it per hour of service. And that's what they meant when they said operations and maintenance consulting.
Robert, I wonder if
Yes.
if you'd allow me to give a little bit of background.
Of course.
We kind of jumped right in, and I'm not sure that all of the executive board understands exactly what we do today. So why don't you let me do that for just a moment? Leslie, you can pop in if I miss something or misspeak. So right now we have a contract with First Transdev to operate our buses in our fixed route bus system, in our paratransit bus system, and in our on-demand bus system. We own the buses, we own the facilities, we own the parts, and they hire the personnel to do the work, and then we pay the wages with a reimbursement schedule. That's called a management contract, the way that we run it. And we work with them every year to produce an operations budget based on experience from the last year and looking forward at what we anticipate might change over the coming year and any inflation. It's not an hourly contract. Their profit, if you will, is built into our reimbursement rates of the things that they do. So the difference is that, so that's the contract we have today. We could operate the services ourselves. We could hire all the personnel, pay for everything ourselves. We've chosen not to do that, in part because both of our operators, both counties have a union for the operators. And we're such a small organization that we don't have our own legal counsel, and we don't have access to legal counsel that is expert on labor negotiations. And so if we were to operate it ourselves, part of our cost of operating it would be making sure that we had the adequate support we needed to do the labor negotiations. The other part of not operating it ourselves is that there's some things that are easier for us to do administratively without having the operations under that administration. Some things are harder, and Robert will get into that, as well as Leslie. There's a third way to run a transit system, and that's called an operations or turnkey contract. And as Robert was beginning to discuss, those contracts are typically hourly, negotiated hourly rate reimbursement based on service miles and then actual service run. So in one case, if we operated ourselves, we'd have full control. In the case of a management contract, we have some control and also some liability. In the case of an operating contract, we would have a little less control and much less liability. So those are the choices before us. And we hired SBLBF so that we could better understand the pros and cons of those choices and help all of you better understand before we go out to RFP and make the decision on which direction we want to go this next time. Leslie, did I miss anything? Or Robert,
Nope.
either one of
Nope,
you?
you got it. Perfect. Thank you.
All right. All right.
That was a great
Thank
background.
you.
Thank you very much. And let me add one other piece of background. SBLBF is comprised of 4 professionals who all have over 40 years, almost 50 in some cases, years of experience in this part of the business. And we've all retired from that and started our own company. But we have been called upon to do work for many of these transit system contractors. And we've been called upon 3 times recently to do exactly what we're doing here, help the transit system decide which is the best contracting method and how do we write the most clear and efficient RFP to do that, and how do we write the most clear and efficient contract that follows from that. Therefore, let me pick up where we were. It does appear to us that it's highly likely that VRT may soon experience significant transit service growth. That's not part of our mission in this study, but it became obvious to us that there will be consideration of that, not only in talking to the executives that you are leading your team, but also in doing 3 peer group comparisons. Peer group comparisons are fraught with danger in interpretation if they are done improperly. One of the things we always do is do multiple peer groups to see if they come. In this case, we did 3 of our own, and then we added in one based upon the information you had been looking at with larger cities. We did one that got the peer group average to come out almost identical in population. We did one that got the peer group average to come out almost identical in fleet size, and one that made the peer group that allowed the peer group average to come out almost identical in budget. The bottom line is the simplest way to look at those 3 is the one that was for population. If you look at the one that had almost identical peer group average population to that of VRT's service area, you'd find that the peer group average had a 49% larger fleet size and a 50% larger budget. Now, this is not to say that you have to make any change to grow the service. It's simply if you consider changing the service one of your strategic objectives in the future, there is a very important point to explain to the users or taxpayers or riders or unions or any other stakeholders involved. The most dramatic comparison, of course, was to Spokane, Washington, which has much different state politics, but has a very, very similar 3% larger population and a budget of 4.7 times that of VRT, 94 million versus 20 million a year.
And that 20 million is our operating budget, not the full budget with the capital.
Correct. Those are both operating numbers. The management contracts around the country include a private provider, a private employer for the transit operators, the transit operator supervisor, or the first layer supervisors usually, the transit mechanics or technicians often, and their first lane supervisors, and sometimes management levels above that. The operating contracts, but they also, as has already been pointed out by Ms. Clegg, the budget is the public budget. You can require all sorts of incentives and disincentives in a management contract, but usually the transit system itself, when it contracts with a management contractor, is assuming that all the financial controls that are necessary can be achieved simply through treating that group of employment as though they were a subsidiary group of the transit agency. In other words, the public budgeting requirements by line item are still applicable if you choose to use them. And they have no right to exceed anything that would be exceeded under your own employees. But often the challenges that crop up, let's take parts, for example. You usually give a wide latitude for the smaller parts purchases so that things can move efficiently time-wise. But once in a while, there's frustration between client agency and contractor under a management contract. Why did you spend that money that you expect to be reimbursed for? Even if you put them through several steps of the same kind of purchasing you would do, that's the kind of frustration that pops up. Doesn't mean it has to be bad. Similarly, on operating contract incentives versus management contract incentives, the management contract usually doesn't have very many large scale penalties for poor performance. Operating contracts, on the other hand, usually are always a private provider employment, but usually have more incentives, have more risk shifting, financial risk shifting to the private provider, and the private financial incentives seem more clear to most policymakers. For example, if I took a board that had never done any of this, or a new board member who had never understood any of this beforehand, and I said, oh, we contract with a private company to provide the service, most of them would assume, oh, it's like road contracting, or maybe like construction contracting, where we give an RFP or an IFB, we ask what needs to be done, they submit a proposal or a bid based on that service that has to be provided, and they give us a price per outcome, per unit of service delivered, per building built, etc. And if they make money, it's usually because they did it within budget and on time. And if they lose money, it's usually because they didn't do it on budget and on time. Operating contractors, we'll talk about who in just a moment, they always would prefer, almost invariably, they would prefer, even if they do both kinds of contracts, they would prefer operating contracts because there's 20 times the revenue in that structure. Similarity, both use private employer structure, and as Ms. Clegg described earlier, you could do that yourself, but if you're working with a large national union, it does have some competitive advantage to have somebody who's dealing with many, many labor contracts around the country when it comes to collective bargaining itself for the 3 or 4 year contract, when it comes to labor interest arbitrations, if that is provided in your market, and of course to the potential for strikes if that's ever an issue. The difference between management contracts is the VRT budget is the control mechanism on the financial side. If you went to an operations contract, the contract itself would be a legal structure that provides more control of liability costs. Now, a footnote to that is it used to be obvious to people that was a bit more inexpensive. We could compare National Transit Database information, but what happened during the pandemic is when labor became scarce, most of the incentives for that saving changed. They didn't go away, they didn't evaporate, but they changed. Next. So the pandemic provided that cost savings that were typically there, that leverage has shifted. Savings of 5% or more were typical before the pandemic, sometimes even more, but we've assisted one medium and one large size transit system since the pandemic started. And in both cases, they were a bit surprised, not terribly, but a bit surprised at the operating contract costs. The operating contract claim potential savings in insurance, they usually say, oh, we'll save you money on the insurance because we have a national risk management plan. The labor fringe rates, they'll tell you they can provide more inexpensively or more efficiently, usually. And the direct labor rates, they often don't try to cut wages, but they often try to moderate the increase per year. But again, the pandemic has shifted many of those. If you can't fill the driver slots you've got, then the supply and demand overrides some of those natural incentives that operator contracts have claimed. Other key issues, and key issues too, either method can implement operating contract incentives, and we'd encourage you to have a manageable number that you can oversee every month and they can provide accurately every month and you can assess every month. But there should be consideration if you go to that, even if it's with a management contract, there should be incentives with that that provide positive incentives for extensive good performance. The organization challenge that you might face is labor relations become sensitive during a switch like this. Labor unions around the country have softened their frustration with the switch to operating contracts, but since it's happened gradually across the country, they expressed, especially in the largest contracts of this type, they expressed extreme concern that they were going to be treated differently. They were going to be treated less valued sentence. Contractor compliance, well, it depends on the key managers, of course. We've seen both kinds of contracts work very well. There's one transit system that we're quite familiar with that won the APTA Transit System of the Year in the size category, respective size category, 7 out of 15 years, and they all were the management contract method. But that's not a guarantee. It's just they had stable managers, they had professional managers, and if you're on the other side of this equation, if you're a young person, male or female, trying to become a transit manager of outstanding performance and pedigree, you usually think first of going to work for an agency directly. But if you look at operating contracting and management contracting, at least it's been the last 20-year experience that you probably would prefer a management contract if you really want to move up the chain, because it's more like working for an agency where you could do, in the best performing transit management contracts, you provide the benefit of private enterprise incentives, but public administration objectives. It doesn't always work that way, but that's why if you're on the other side as the transit manager who aspires to a long career, you tend to have longer career patterns on that side. In the operating contract side, there certainly are excellent managers found. We're not suggesting anything else, but it depends. And the turnover rate in those contracts, if you control for the size of contract, the turnover is a bit higher because there's more pressure, economic, profit pressure on those managers. But the companies prefer those because there's 20 times the revenue in typical contracts. There is a competitive environment in either. There's a more competitive environment in the operating contracts. Typically, you'll find 3 or 4 bids returned in a competitive selection process for an operating contract. Typically, you'll see 1 or 2 if it's a management RFP. The management contract competitors that have recently bid or proposed on a management contract structure include TransDev, the ones you have now, RATP Dev, which is in 30 or so markets, Kiesling, which has a dozen or so, I don't have the exact count, in the Northeast, Southland Transit, which again, I don't have the exact count, but it has a dozen or so in the Southern California area, and HTG, which is a group, the president is John Hendrickson, who once was with RATP Dev, and now he has spun off He has spun off his company and has 6 or 7. In the operations contract competitors, oh, I'm sorry, in the management contract, I didn't mean to skip. We Drive You is the new name for what used to be National Express. National Express is also one of the larger school bus companies in the country. And they have the contract, management style contract in Charlotte, North Carolina, one of the bigger ones in the country. Operations contract competitors includes, again, Transdev, MV Transportation, RITB Dev, Keolis, and We Drive You. And there's others out there, smaller providers. In both cases, there's a few others, but those are the ones that have the most market representation currently. Which methods fit which agencies? Well, the smallest transit agencies in the country, when there's well over 1,000 transit agencies, so this would probably be the smaller 300 or 350. They almost all use direct employees. It's just they don't see the benefit of doing anything that's more complicated structure. The largest agencies, on the other hand, almost always provide their own top-level management, but contract out part of the service. In the 80s and 90s, there was a big push to contracting out the park and ride express bus service. Lately, it's micro transit and ADA service, and sometimes a large part of the fixed route service. The largest operating contract in the country that we're aware of is in Long Island. Currently, it's over $100 million a year. The medium-sized agencies, which I would include Boise as one of the smaller part of the medium-sized agencies for now, and they tend to use all 3 methods: direct service provision by in-house employees, the management contract method, and the operating contract method. Transit management contracts began in the 60s when Congress began giving more federal assistance for transit. And when operating assistance was invented later, after first with capital grants, then operating grants were added in the 74, I believe. After a few years of the unions watching local governments, Miami was one of the biggest cases, say, well, we're taking over this bankrupt local provider. We're going to use some federal funds for the grants to buy the buses and so forth. But we have a rule against direct supervision of unions, so we're not going to recognize that union. That worked for about 4 or 5 years for the local governments, and then Congress was persuaded by appeals by the largest labor unions to say, no, you can't do it. You can't use our grants to worsen the position of labor. So that's when management company contracts were invented. It was a simple solution. Well, they had been invented, but that's when they took off. That's when it went from a handful around the country to about 250 or so contracts in the United States. And from 70 to 2000, it was almost always, at least in smaller systems, if you did a management contract, you included all the transit employees up through and including the general manager. And from 2000 to now, most of those that have used the management contract method have kept the top layer of managers as government or agency employees and only contracted to the operations and maintenance personnel. And that leads us to your questions. We are working very hard with your staff on getting the next step, which is the RFI, the request for information. But we would certainly love to answer your questions right now if possible.
Thank you so much. Questions from anybody? Or Elaine? Yes.
Well, I hope there will be questions. We wanted you to understand this is, we don't do this very often. It is the biggest part of our budget. We want to make sure that we make the right choice here. I'll just summarize, if I could, what Robert presented to us. VRT on average is 49% lower on overall operating budget than the typical transit agency for population our size, which indicates that we are ripe for growth. Also, I think there's a lot of opportunity to talk about funding, and if that can be solved, I think we will grow. So we need to keep that in the back of our mind as we do this. Management contracts have pluses and minuses, as do operations contracts. The RFI that Robert mentioned is designed for us to get more detailed information from both management and operating providers about what issues they see, what things they are interested in, what would entice them or not entice them to participate in a bid if we open an RFP. So we'll have more information later, but we wanted to make sure that we had good direction from all of you going into that RFP process, so that we ask the right questions into that RFI process. So we ask the right questions as we do that, and also begin to understand from you concerns you have, either have already had or related to what you heard today.
Very good. Thank you so much. Maybe I'll start one off and see if that gets it rolling. So as you were discussing, yeah, I agree. The disparity is alarming, shocking, all that above. Not surprising, unfortunately. I wish it was. But I know, like, when I travel, I love to use public transportation as much as possible to be able to get around. And I think as a board, like the Boise State football games and things like that, it's a great benefit to have. And so in looking at that, I know that you had shown like Spokane, Washington, and just how different it was between there and here with a very similar population size. But you also made the very valid point of the state political scene is so different between those two. And so I guess the question I have is, and I know it's difficult. I was actually just Googling real quick population sizes, because I was thinking in my mind, what's another metro area that's similar to our political scene, the state, and similar to our size of our metro area here? And it's difficult. I know Salt Lake City comes to mind, but they are a bit bigger than us. They're metropolitan, even though Boise is technically actually larger than Salt Lake City by population, but the metro area is significantly bigger in the Salt Lake area. Yeah. I was thinking Billings, I Googled them, and we're quite a bit bigger than them. Even like the St. George area, we're so much bigger than them. Is there any that you found, metropolitan area, that is similar, or I guess maybe what's the one that's the most similar to us population-wise and state politically wise? Does that make sense, kind of that question?
It certainly does. And I share your comment that it is very difficult to find a one-to-one peer if you try to control in that manner. It's important, but it's very difficult. I would suggest that you peek at another city in your same set of parameters, which is Huntsville, Alabama, a very purple city politically in a very red state. And they have very similar issues that you're dealing with right now. And they're growing. They have very big growth plans, but they're right now not very many service miles or service hours per population, et cetera, or fleet size or budget. It is difficult. If you look at Oklahoma City, I think that might help you see the most simple comparison. Oklahoma City has been through many of the same issues you face right now. They were getting frustrated with them because the economy of Oklahoma City was growing, and the regional population was obviously generating lots of traffic congestion, much like in your region of VRT. And what happened there is very interesting, because they went to 5-year sales tax votes, and one passed a new streetcar, funded it for construction, et cetera, and ongoing operating costs. One of them did for one important BRT line, and now they're taking a hard look at the issues that might lead it to regional transit authority. You're already a bit more regional than Oklahoma City Transit Park. They're not a national model that's doing everything right, but they have faced very similar questions, concerns, and political motivations up and down the budget for transit, and they have moved upward in recent years. And they were not, transit was not asked to do everything in these 5-year sales tax votes, but they were the major element of 2.5 of them, I guess is the way to put it. So that's the way it's worked well in Oklahoma, and it's still an ongoing process. And in Georgia, a similar thing is going on right now with Clayton County, a large suburb to the south of Atlanta. Similar thing went on with Gwinnett County in the northeast suburbs of Atlanta. Again, it's different because you have the core city and its surrounding environment. They do not, but there's, if you take that huge difference away, many of the other issues politically and economically are quite comparable.
Yeah. Oh, go ahead, Elaine.
Just as a follow-up to that, Robert, do you happen to know what kind of operating system each of those use?
In Oklahoma City, it's direct service provision with their own employees, or it has been until this year. I haven't checked this year, but it has been. Because they started as a city department and they were comfortable with what they were doing. And in Gwinnett County, Georgia, the suburb to the northeast of Atlanta, it's an operating contract method. And in Clayton, I believe it's an operating contract method. I can check on that quickly. I'm sure if we gave, you asked a great question. I'm giving you a quick response from my memory. I'm sure if you gave us a week, we'd come up with 3, 4, 5 also that are very comparable. There's probably one in Texas. There's probably one in Florida. There's probably one in Indiana.
Oh, no, you're good. Thank you so much for that. Other questions? Lance?
Yeah. The number about 20 times the profit, right? As compared to the maybe
20 times the revenue.
20 times the revenue, sorry.
20 times the revenue, which typically would translate into about 5 to 8 times the profit.
Okay. Compared to the roughly 5% in savings, I'm wondering specifically how that's calculated and where that's coming from.
Well, they believe when they're bidding one of these, they try to lose no money. They try to leave nothing on the table, as they say, competitively. In both directions, they try to sharpen their pencil and get it right. If they've estimated it properly, they probably can save you a little bit on insurance costs or loss control. Perhaps not. They probably can save you a little bit on fringe benefits costs, but again, none of your costs are out of line right now. So and when they're bidding for the first time, they typically do not, because of what used to be called FTA Section 13C is now called FTA Section 5333B, because of those incentives to not create a disadvantage to labor by the movement from one method to another while you're spending FTA grant money. Because of that, they very rarely try to cut wages at the outset, but they often try to reduce the rate of increase over 5 years, if that makes sense. But they'll promise that they have better software. They'll promise that they have better many solutions, but it really boils down to those 3 usually.
Perfect. Any other questions? Did you follow up, Lance? Or
Not so related, separate question, but Elaine mentioned right now that some of the element of control from the management contract comes from ownership of assets, right? I'm wondering if or what kind of ownership situation is typical with an operating contract or operations contract, and if that's different, what that transition might look like.
Certainly. Well, you have the option of doing it a number of different ways, but in almost all the recent bids, the transit system itself owns the buses and related equipment. The transit system owns the garage. It used to be that operating contractors were often called upon to provide either buses or facilities, but nowadays that's not very common, at least on one of this size. Where it used to be common is in really rapid service additions. In other words, you've just passed a big initiative. Like Dallas years ago, after they passed their new sales tax, 1%, 13 different cities paying in a 1 cent sales tax, the promise of light rail being built rapidly throughout the area, the promise of added service rapidly grown. What they did is they left their public provided transit service alone for about 4 years, the first 4 years of that change in the large organization budgets and so forth, called DTS, Dallas Transit System. They left it alone for a few years, and they layered on top of that the operating contract to provide the garage facilities and the fleet for the new express bus service. And it was about a 15% service addition. It was a very large one-time addition, but they wanted to get service out to the suburbs that had joined in, had no service in rapid time. While they were doing a 15-year build out of light rail, they wanted to get service on the street immediately. That doesn't happen very often any longer. Hasn't happened. That kind of scale has not happened very recently. If you had that kind of scale, where if VRT, in a rapid planning sort of way, got a huge increase in funding and a huge mandate to add service all over, you might consider that.
So Robert,
is it, because you already have the fleet.
Is it true, would it be correct to say that most likely the bid we would get, the one thing that would switch to the private provider would be the parts, and we'd have to do an inventory and a cost, and they'd buy what we have already in inventory, and then they would keep it in supply. Is that correct?
Yes, but the simplest way to, yes, and there's several ways to do it. The simplest way contractually to keep your sanity, keep it simple, keep it clear, keep it auditable, is the agency retains their ownership, just like they do of the buses. They retain their ownership of the parts inventory, but they allow the new transit operating contractor who's included a parts cost in their budget, in their contract. The simplest way to do it is to have them, as they treat it like a library book, as they pull parts out of that original inventory that they did. And you have the right every year or every month, if you want, to keep parts audits going on. And at the end of their contract, the extent to which they owe parts, they have to buy those that they subtracted and not replaced.
And in part in preparation,
to make things a lot simpler, because
in part in preparation for whichever way we go, the contract you approved in the consent agenda allows us to buy a system that when the parts come in, they get scanned and automatically entered into inventory. And then we'll do the physical inventory check once a year to make sure everything's accurate.
Right. And the reason I say that, what I just described as simpler, is if you require, and often it's been done that way, where you require them to buy out the inventory. Well, the first thing they'll do if you don't have it ironed down ahead of time is they'll say, well, we don't want those parts. They're old. We don't want those parts. You've got too many of these widgets on the shelf that we'll never use. All these small arguments that are just unnecessary. If you do it the other way, more like a library method, they know what their shelves have on them that you own. They have the right to use them, record them. They have to record everything they do, but with that comes their liability to replace every part they use.
Perfect. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. In light of time, we'll probably move on. If anybody does have any specific questions, I'm sure Mr. Babbitt is available via email or a phone call. If you'd like to reach out, we can get you that information. So we do have, just wrapping up our Section 6 Executive Board, just for your information, there are procurement calendars in your packet of information. I do not believe we have a need for executive session. And then also department staff reports are in your packet as well, pages 29 through 40, in regards to those, to review those and look at those. Unless there's anything else that executive committee members feel needs to come forward, we will then adjourn this meeting at this time. Thank you so much. And thank you, Mr. Babbitt, for being here and presenting that information.
Thank you for this opportunity. Have a good day.
Thank you so much. We stand adjourned.